Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I do the California Highways webpage.
I'm Tom Fear. I'm one of 4 administrators for Gribble Nation.
This is episode 1.02, Building a State Highway System, the 1920s.
Last time on California Highways Route by Route, we started our journey on the highways of California by establishing historical context. How was the state highway system in California created? We began by looking at the period before 1920 and the beginning of the state highway system. We saw how early development was haphazard and little organized until the following happened. In 1902, constitutional changes authorizing the state to construct and maintain roads. The first large bond issues providing funding for construction and defining the state highway system as opposed to piecemeal road definition.
Now, we did make a few mistakes in the last episode. Our mouths sort of got ahead of our heads, so we'd like to fix the record. Regarding the 1909 Emigrant Gap State Road, we mistakenly said it was later US 50. It's really US 40. And regarding the road from Mecca to Blythe, Tom had noted that it was later Route 195. And I edited in that it was US 70 and 60 and I-10 from Indio to Blythe. That was sort of imprecise. It was US 60 and US 70 and I-10 from the point where Box Canyon meets the route today, which is approximately Pinto Road. I don't think that place has any official name. In this episode, we're going to continue our journey, looking at the changes in the 1920s. We'll see how California put in its first gas tax. We'll learn about the Melville Act, which allowed the state to take over traversable highways through small cities that can't afford them, not just the rural highways between cities. We'll see the start of the U.S. highway system. We'll see the Breed Bill, and we'll see some reorganization of state offices. We'll also have a guest speaker, Joel Windmill of the Lincoln Highway Association.
As a reminder, here's what happened before 1920. The establishment of the first state highways in California, the creation of the Surveyor's Office, the establishment of the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road connecting Sacramento to Carson Valley, the establishment of governance structures, the Department of Highways, state constitutional amendments, initial funding efforts, acts that provided for funding of specific highways, the Federal Aid Highway Act, 3 state highway bond acts of 1909, 1915, and 1919.
By the 1920s, we had about 65 state highways. But note that there really were no signed route numbers. There really were no legislative defined route numbers, although there was a numbered list that was maintained by the California Highway Commission or the Department of Engineering. And the state was really starting to see problems with the approach of doing bond issues for each group of highways. The bonds provided funds for construction, but they didn't cover any ongoing maintenance, and that proves to be costly. And the recommendation at the time was to have a tax on gasoline sales. In 1921, the Department of Public Works was created. This included the State Highway Commission, the State Water Commission, and the Division of Highways. There were 7 new highways defined. Routes including major ones, Rio Vista to Lodi, which is today's Route 12, Watsonville to US 101, today's Route 129, Cambria to San Simeon, which was Route 1, the Mother Lode Highway, Route 49, Vallejo to Sears Point, Route 37, Manteca to Maasdale, which is Route 120 today, and Alturas to Nevada, which is Route 299. And most of these were just transfers of county routes into the state highway system with little construction. I know you've done some blogs on some of these, Tom. Do you have anything to add?
Well, pretty much all of these were established in the 19th century as major thoroughfares of transportation. You can pretty much look at Bancroft's map of the late 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, and you're going to see a lot of these highways were already on the map at the time. The 1921 Federal Highway Act rejected the view of long-distance road advocates who wanted the federal government to build a national highway network. Federal aid was limited to a system of federal aid highways not to exceed 7% of all roads in a state. 3/7 of the system must consist of roads that are interstate in character, meaning that they have to connect from one state line to another, not like the interstate highway system as we would know it today. They just basically had to connect to a state line. At least 60% of these roads were required to be linked at state lines, and paved surfaces were required to be at least 18 feet wide. So this is something you'll see is kind of a modern difference. Your average travel lane on a freeway is going to be 18 feet wide. That's pretty much all you got at the time in the 1920s. That was considered a very, very good road. State highway agencies had the authority to consider local concerns in deciding the mix of projects.
In 1923, we saw some governance changes. The State Highway Commission, which is distinct from the Division of Highways, was removed from the Department of Public Works, and I believe it was made independent. We saw 3 new districts created: Stockton, Bishop, and San Bernardino. That brought the total number of highway districts to 10. The Bridge Department was also created in the Department of Public Works. Prior to this, most of the counties did their own right-of-way design and construction of bridges. This standardized the bridge efforts and the bridge engineering.
Bridge designs in the early 20th century had some pretty wild variances. Today, you'll kind of see established guidelines because they've been kind of the standard for a very long time. But you used to see very strange things like wooden suspension bridges. There was a lot of truss bridges that were built in California kind of in this era that were some of the first standardized structures that you would see that were later incorporated in the state highways.
Also in 1923, we saw some major funding changes for the highway system. We saw California's first gas tax. The revenue from this 2-cent a gallon tax was divided between the state and the counties. The idea for a gas tax dated back to recommendations from the Auto Club in 1921 and the State Board of Equalization, which governs taxes, and the Highway Commission in 1922. The tax had an explicit prohibition against being used for new construction. That was removed in 1927. So the bonds could be used for new construction and the tax was used for maintenance until 1927. The accompanying legislation created the Motor Vehicle Fuel Fund, with some of the money going directly to counties and other funds being deposited in the State Highway Maintenance Fund for maintenance, repair, widening, resurfacing, and reconstruction of state highways and roads and highways in the parks.
So in other words, the gas tax isn't a new phenomena.
No, it's not. We had it long before the Collier-Burns Act, which was in 47, I believe, and it just wasn't enough, and it couldn't be used for new construction originally.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see what the inflation rate might be, 2 cents converted into modern dollars. I kind of wonder, it probably lines up more with modern times than most people would probably realize.
True.
In 1923, 2 highways are added to completed connections, Truckee to Nevada. This was ultimately turned into Legislative Route 38 or Route 38, which was first defined in 1911 between Myers Station and McKinley's, extended to Tahoe City in 1915, extended to Nevada in 1919. So basically, this provided for a replacement of the old Hennis Pass Road. So if you're kind of familiar with your Lincoln Highway history a little bit, the northern spur followed Hennis Pass Road instead of following the Truckee River and First Continental Railroad. So if you're driving Interstate 80 today, you follow the Truckee River. Pretty much the older highway before this addition was all located to the north on the Hennis Pass Road and is pretty haggard. I've been up there a very, very long time ago doing some off-roading. It would have been quite the adventure to be on that road.
So the change between 1919 and 1923 was in a rewording of this to remove a reference to the Dog Valley grade, that it went from being continuing through the town of Truckee, crossing Procer Creek and over what is known as Dog Valley grade as far as the state line, to a continuing through the town of Truckee and by the most practicable route to the Nevada state line. Does Dog Valley grade revert to that Hennessy Pass Road?
It does. It actually continues west of Highway 89 all the way pretty much to the western flank of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's really probably one of the most least known Trans-Sierra highways that's out there, but it played a major purpose in that it was part of the early Lincoln Highway. So it's kind of interesting that US 40 would inherit this corridor because it was very, very different, almost right up to the emergence of the US route system. Also added was the Bayshore Highway, which was Route 68 and later U.S. Route 101. And this contrasts with Route number 2, which was defined in 1909 between San Francisco and San Diego. Route 68 was to lay out and construct a highway or highways from the county line separating the city and county of San Francisco into and through the county of San Mateo at such location or locations as said California Highway Commission may select. So basically, if you're kind of looking at it through modern lenses, this is the Bayshore Freeway corridor, is what it evolved into eventually. This was extended in 1925 to San Jose. This is the eventual expressway, then freeway, and of course, bypass of US 101. When we get to the US 101 podcast, we'll go through this in detail. It gets kind of weird. There's a US 101 main line, then there's a US 101 bypass, there's a US 101 alternate. It gets really, really weird in relation to the Bayshore Highway.
So the LRN2 was what became the Surface Street Old 101, and LRN 68, which is what this is referring to, is what eventually became the freeway version of 101. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Also at this time, the federal aid system was completed. So in November 1923, working with state highway agencies, the Bureau of Public Roads completed designation of the federal aid system. This total, where I got it from, didn't get it in miles, 272,000 kilometers, or 5.9% of all public roads. The federal aid system would expand as states completed work on their original system. You'll see, if you look at highway designations, notions like FAS and FAP and FAU. That refers to this original federal aid system. There was federal aid primary, federal aid secondary, and federal aid urban highways, and they all had different funding schemes.
Up to this point, there's barely a system really noticeable to the established public. At best, it was the auto trails, which were signed by local associations or national associations. Directions were ad hoc and basically generally physical landmarks as opposed to standardized signage. Some auto trail associations were better at it than others, but really it was not uniform in any way. Signage was small, meaning like reassurance shields, usually posted on telephone poles or trees. 3 bands of color, too, and that was it. Yeah, really, it's just a rectangle with a small pattern on it. It probably wouldn't even be noticeable to the modern eye from modern highway speeds. There's no uniform highway safety signage either. So basically, all these signs that you see on highways today, there basically was really no standard equivalent to this. So what this is referring to, this is the era before the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD. There was no established standard. It was all over the place. So like today, you have colors that correspond to certain signages. Really, you didn't have anything of the like. You could just get random weird signs, and that's what you got.
Yeah, I recall, I think, stop signs at the time, some of them were yellow.
Yeah, that actually was, I believe, one of the first standardizations was to make those yellow, and I forget exactly when the switch to red was, but that would be a good example. It was just something completely different than what you would probably see in any modern sense. November 1924, the American Association of State Highway Officials proposed the federal highway system, which we would know today as the U.S. route system, to coordinate the naming and marking of interstate highways. This was requested by the Secretary of Agriculture to select a system of highways and appointed a board to perform a study and make recommendations in March 1925. The initial routes were selected from the federal aid road system. Routes had to be marked by means of standard highway marking signage. The basic goal was to have U.S. highway mileage be no more than 3% of the total certified rural miles in a state. California's eventual mileage was about 2,200 miles, or 3.1%.
I think it's important to note the role of AASHO, AASHO, in this, which is states could not just arbitrarily pick a number in this system. The numbers all had to be approved and be authorized for use. And that continues today, still for U.S. highways and still for interstate highways, by the same organization, which has just added a T to its name to represent transit. It's now AASHTO.
Yeah, and this is kind of where this gets interesting in the road community. You often hear kind of spitball talk. Like one I hear from my area is, why is California State Route 99 not an interstate, aside from the standards? Some places probably aren't up to interstate par, but you just can't suddenly sign something in interstate because it meets standards. You actually have to submit a request, and it has to be approved by the executive commission on all these numberings. So it's quite a hassle. It usually takes several months. If you do it correctly, it often gets spit back. So it's not as straightforward as people probably think it is, and it never has been.
No, it hasn't, and we still see a lot of people who get very enthusiastic about why certain roads aren't interstates or aren't U.S. highways. And this is one of the things that slows down the process. But since we're talking about numbering, there was a basic rhyme and reason to the numbering approach for U.S. highways. And we'll cover this more in a future numbering episode. But for the U.S. highway system, the basic approach was even numbers were for east-west routes, with multiples of 10 being principal routes. Odd numbers were for north-south routes, with major numbers ending in 1 or 5. Of course, we had an exception of that here in California with 99. 3-digit routes are branches off to 2-digit routes. Now, this is very different than what you'll see in the interstates. There was no notion of loops or spurs. They just assigned them sequentially, and no, US 101 is not a branch off of US 1. They numbered it that way just because it was a parallel highway on the other coast. The numbers had to be approved by the AASHO organization.
So what's interesting about US 101, and I've never seen this explicitly stated in any official document, but my understanding is that the 10 is actually considered a single digit. So basically it's kind of acting as that principal U.S. north-south U.S. route ending in 1. And it's kind of interesting to me because, like, you look at it kind of historically, kind of a toss-up between 99 and 101, which was the more principal route. Kind of goes to one highway or the other in different locations, would be my opinion anyways.
So you're saying US 101 is really US 10-1?
Correct.
Cool. That is, I never knew that. That's really interesting. I'll look at it very differently at that point. And think about the implication of that if they were ever to do a 3-digit route off of US 101.
Yeah, it would probably have to be something like 2101 or something weird like that.
2101, yeah. Really weird.
So, the 1925 U.S. route system. In 1925, the numbering system for the federal highways, or U.S. routes, was adopted. A shield design was finalized, which was based off the Great Seal of the United States. In 1928, the auto clubs, not the Division of Highways, started signing the U.S. routes. Some of the U.S. routes would have had unclear and unsigned routings, even into the early 1930s, which is infamously, as recently discovered, the case in Los Angeles, which was not actually signed in the city until December 1930.
And there were like, because you investigated this, like 4 or 5 different things that all claimed to be US 66.
Yeah, and most of them were probably never actually signed as US 66. Like, it's a little bizarre. Like, you have 7th and Broadway, which is generally claimed to be the terminus of US Route 66, which was the terminus of the National Old Trails Road, but is never had any documented proof that it was actually signed as US 66. So the first signed terminus, western terminus of US 66 in Los Angeles, would have been at the Santa Monica city limit, which was pulled back to Fletcher Drive and San Fernando Road by January 1931. And the initial U.S. routes in the state of California, U.S. Route 40, which was largely aligned over the North Lincoln Highway and Victory Highway by way of Donner Pass. U.S. 48, which this one's probably the least known. This was aligned over the Lincoln Highway via Altamont Pass. U.S. 50, which was aligned over the South Lincoln Highway via Johnson's Pass. And this was not actually part of the 1925 plan. U.S. 50 was originally planned to end in Fernley, Nevada, but was extended to the last minute in the 1926 version of the U.S. route system. U.S. 66, as we already noted, was part of the original U.S. routes in California, but it was originally intended to be designated as U.S. 60, and there's a very long story about how that happened, but Kentucky instigated it because they wanted a east-west U.S. route ending in 0. But for the most part, U.S. 66 was aligned over the National Old Trails Road. U.S. Route 80, which was aligned over the Old Spanish Trail, U.S. Route 91, which was aligned over the Arrowhead Trail, U.S. 99, which was aligned over the Pacific Highway and what was known within California as the Inland Route. So basically, this would bring it over the famous Ridge Route. U.S. Route 101, which was aligned over the Redwood Highway, Pacific Highway, and the American variation of the El Camino Real. U.S. Route 199, which was aligned over part of the Redwood Highway into Oregon. There was additions to the U.S. route system, but those come later, mostly in the 1930s.
Now is the time in the podcast when we bring in a guest to talk about a subject related to the episode. Today's guest is Joel Windmiller, who is joining us to talk about the U.S. highway system in general, its impact, and the Lincoln Highway in particular. Joel, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Joel Windmiller. I'm a highway historian and also the current California chapter president for the Lincoln Highway Association here in California.
Joel, can you tell us, in your opinion, what was the importance of the establishment of the U.S. route system both to the nation and in particular to California?
Well, the nation in California, it gave a number to a route and everything instead of a name. The named highways had so many named highways, it was a big confusion to the motoring public and everything. So when the federal government decided to do a numbered system, it simplified it and allowed an organized numbering system going east-west and north-south, even being east-west and odd being north-south.
We had mentioned previously the major U.S. highways that were created. What was your impression of that first set of highways? And I know one of your favorites was in there.
Oh, yes. The first set of highways, it just gave point A to point B, connecting the major cities in the state and everything. 101, 99, and 80, and 66. So it's just a basic system to connect the major cities of California. The state of California followed with their own numbering system to connect the counties and the major cities as well. But the state of California kind of confused the situation by having several different numbering systems going on at the same time. They started in 1895 with the formation of the state highway system and then added the legislative route numbers. And then in the 30s, the state added their numbering system, then came in the federal numbering system. So it was approximately 4 numbering systems, if I remember.
And it was even more confusing because the legislative route system wasn't codified, written down in the legislative code until 36. Before that, it was just a list in the Division of Highways.
Well, yeah, it was a list in the Division of Highways, and you would only find the legislative route numbers on state official maps, which were in state publications only, not available to the general public. You had mentioned earlier confusion over highways, and I know you're involved with the Lincoln Highway Association. How much confusion was there before the numbering between the North Lincoln Highway and the South Lincoln Highway? Well, there wasn't any confusion and everything because the Lincoln Highway was also co-signed with the Victory over Donner Summit, so you had 2 highways going over Donner, but the southern route was called the Pioneer Route over Echo Summit. The Lincoln Highway Association, when they were planning the route, came to western Nevada and then decided, we're going to need 2 routes over the Sierras to make sure one of them is open to the motoring public to get people into the state of California. The best-known highways from this early set were things like the Lincoln Highway, Route 66, and in some lesser extent in the popular public, I would say, US 99. A lot of the other routes that were introduced never achieved the popularity, and that includes even 101. You don't see as much nostalgia for old 101 that you do for old 99 or old 66. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there was never this big nostalgia for US 91 or something like that?
I think that last question is a really good one. It's like with US 80, I'm finding there was no response to that blog I put out about the Point Loma, at all. It's just kind of amazing to me that major East-West U.S. route has no fanfare. But when I did the US 66 stuff for LA, I was getting all sorts of crazy stuff getting responses.
US 66 is really popular, I think. US 99 and the Lincoln Highway, I think, are a close second. You don't see quite as much nostalgia about US 101. You see almost nothing. Well, there's a little bit out there about 395. There's the whole El Camino Sierra stuff on 395, and 395 is a wonderful road. But the other stuff, how much do you hear people waxing rhapsodic about US 199 or 299? How much do you hear people talk about US 91? These are much more forgotten, and certainly US 60 and US 70, due to their multiplexes, are well forgotten, and the only thing people remember about US 80 is the plank road.
Yeah. US 99 seems to be getting something of a following this last decade, I've noticed, but really it's just, aside from what you mentioned, it's just kind of interesting how some roads just don't really have much of a fanfare.
Well, in my opinion, basically 66 and 99 goes back to the Dust Bowl age of everybody coming to California to find work and get their families going again. So those things were popularized by the route that the Dust Bowl families took to get here to the state to get into the Central Valley.
Joel, out of all the auto trails, I probably would say it's safe to say that the Lincoln Highway was among the more important ones. What role did that play in proving that basically continental travel overland could be done?
Well, the founding fathers, Carl Fisher and of the Indianapolis Speedway and everything, and the chairman of Packard Motor Company and everything, wanted to have a brick highway from New York to San Francisco across the country and everything to get everybody to the 1915 Pan-Pacific Expedition in San Francisco. And they needed to get a reliable road built across the country, and they just used what routes were available and everything, and they had to improve them, and they also tried to get the government to pay for it. Problem is, the government wouldn't do it, so they had to go to the private sector of corporations to help fund the highway.
Then after the emergence of the U.S. route system, the Lincoln Highway really is one of the few auto trails that's really kind of stuck around through the test of time. And from what I recall, in the early drafts of the U.S. route system, the Pioneer route was intended to stay as the Lincoln Highway before U.S. 50 was extended in the final U.S. route plan. How long did the Lincoln Highway really hang on as a prominent entity after the U.S. route system was created?
Well, the Lincoln Highway, in what we in the association call our final hurrah, is to put up 2,500 7-foot concrete markers identifying the route across the country. They wanted something long-lasting and permanent to remind the traveling public that the Lincoln Highway traveled along that route, even though it was now signed as a U.S. route.
Who did the original signing of all the named trails and highways?
Well, the Lincoln Highway, we did it ourselves. Now, as for other routes, I wouldn't have an answer for you. The Lincoln, we handled it ourselves, and then as California State Automobile Association came on board to sign routes in the western states, they also helped us out by posting their own signs with California State Automobile Association on the bottom.
Was the California State Automobile Association signing things like the Pacific Highway, to your knowledge? Because I know that was one of the major ones that became, 99 and so on.
I know up in Oregon and Washington, they signed it through the state. Now, as for any identification of the Pacific Highway or anything like that, it would have been on the mileage signs that AAA Diamonds had. And it would be the route that's on top of the diamond that would identify what highway you were on. Because they had some for Lincoln, and also they had some for the Redwood Highway and Pacific Highway up and down the Central Valley up here. And I think they did some things for El Camino Real for 101. CSAA, that's the only time that I've seen any type of route on a route sign.
When the U.S. highways came in, how did the transition from being a named highway or a named trail to a numbered highway work?
Well, the Lincoln Highway posts and Lincoln Highway signs were still up in this area. Only thing I know is they either took down the Lincoln Highway sign, left posts, and then put up the U.S. shields for 40, 50, 99 along the route here in California.
Was 48 also part of the Lincoln Highway?
Yes, it was. It was part of the original 1913 alignment from French Camp over to Castro Valley. It was seen on maps and everything that 48 went down to Hayward and everything, so the 13 alignment of the Lincoln Highway pretty much followed Foothill Boulevard into Oakland and then down to Jack London Square, where it crossed into San Francisco at the Ferry Building.
How is the Lincoln Highway preserved today? I know that it's very active still as far as association, way more so than the other auto trail groups.
Well, we're still promoting the highway. We're still getting out there and creating new replica posts to replace the ones that are missing. We're making sure that local agencies and everything maintain the Lincoln monuments across the country. And here in California, we're one of the few chapters that do create our own replica Lincoln Highway markers. And we're working with cities, counties, and the state to put up Lincoln Highway shields along the alignment here in California. So we're very active and still promoting the highway and still having people get out there and enjoy a nice 2-lane road experience of not being on the freeway, going at 80 miles an hour, and just watching the scenery go by and not enjoying it.
Yeah, something I definitely enjoy from the Lincoln Highway Association is the interactive map that shows the different generations and alignments. Seems like that took some considerable work to track all that information down, given some of that isn't necessarily through a road anymore.
Yeah, that's true, Tom. That was a 1.5-year project to get that thing all researched and put together and then put on Google Maps. And a caveat is it's real helpful when our web person works for Google. So basically we had a little inside thing to get it overlaid on Google Maps.
Have they done that for any of the other U.S. highways? I'd expected, I think, for 66, and I believe there's something like that for at least portions of 99.
Yeah, I know it's for 66. 99 has portions of it and everything. It just they need to put a request in with Google, and they need to have the alignments all figured out and all research and everything so they can just give the information to Google, and they just overlay it on the map.
Do you want to give a plug for where people can find the Lincoln Highway Association and the map?
Yeah, the Lincoln Highway Association, we have our website at Lincoln Highway Association. You can open it. You can get the history on the highway. You can go in and see where our meetings and our conferences connect with the Lincoln Highway Trading Post, where you can get Lincoln Highway swag, signs, wearables. And you can also check out the California chapter and see what we're doing, our meetings, and find out through our association newsletter, The Traveler, what's the history of here in California and what's going on. We're active and we have a good website going, and I want to give a plug that Folsom, California will host the national conference next June. So if anybody wants to learn about the highway and see some members and go on trips on the road, it'll be in Folsom, California next June.
Do you want to give the URL of the website?
Yeah. It's www.Lincoln Highway Association, basically spelled ASSOC.org.
So it's LincolnHighwayAssoc.org.
Yes.
Any other final closing questions, Tom?
No, I think that's all I had. It's just a lot of work goes into that site, and it's something I definitely appreciate on Gribble Nation. So I definitely don't mind plugging it, because this is definitely a worthwhile site if anyone's into highway history that's listening to the podcast.
I'd like to return the favor, Tom, on your Gribble Nation. I read that often and everything, and I appreciate all the research you do.
I definitely appreciate hearing that.
Thank you, Joel, very much for your time on and coming on. We like to get the folks who do other highway sites to talk about things, and we may very well give you a call back when we're working route by route and get up to US 40 and US 50.
Sure. Be looking forward to it. Thank you very much for having me on, and hope I gave you guys what you needed to know about the Lincoln Highway and my opinion on the U.S. systems.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
In 1925, we had the Melville Act. This authorized the use of convict labor on state roads, and it stated that the Highway Commission has full possession of all state roads. It has the power to acquire the right-of-way, to alter or change the route, or even abandon the roads if need be. It is required to maintain all state roads, and municipalities can turn over streets to the Highway Commission. I don't know whether they can still do that, where they can just say, we don't want this street anymore, state, it's yours to do. I sort of doubt it. And they were authorized to do eminent domain to acquire highways. So they could just say, we are buying this road for a state highway.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about if they could still abandon roadways, because what comes to mind is Highways 39 and 173, which have had long closed sections. And as far as my understanding is, there's been no real traction and effort to relinquish them.
When, I go through the Highway Commission or Transportation Commission now minutes from my pages. And there are two sections in there, one dealing with relinquishment and one dealing with vacation. They can certainly relinquish highways back to the city or the county. They can also vacate certain parcels and certain properties and just say, we're not going to take care of it anymore. It's no longer ours. No, we don't have responsibility for it. But they've never done that for certain roads, in particular things like Route 39. I think that's because one of these days they'd love to eventually reopen it. And if they want to reopen it, they'll keep it on the books. Also in 1925, some more highways were added to the system. We saw San Rafael to San Quentin. This is the future I-580. It was Route 17 for a long time up in that area, as I recall, over the top of the bay. We had the stretch from Needles to Topic, which is US 66 or I-40. If you recall, in the last episode, we talked about they're doing Barstow to Needles. This is now extending it closer to the Arizona state line. We had the Oxnard connection created. This was originally signed Route 3. It became US 101A, the coast route, and later became Route 1 along the coast near Oxnard. It went right by the summer camp I went to as a kid. And I remember their address was 40401. And back then it was Route 2 Malibu, and I can't remember why it was Route 2 for some reason. Crescent City to Oregon, which was US 101. Barstow to Jean, which was US 91, later became I-15, and was also part of 466. A really tiny, odd route was added at this time from Ukiah to the Mendocino State Hospital, which I now think is the city of 1,000 Buddhas.
It is. It's in Talmage. It's a very strange highway.
It's one of the shorter highways in the state, in fact.
Yeah, it's not signed with reassurance signage, but there's plenty of post miles, and there's a bridge identification placard over the Russian River.
They added the Angels Camp to Calaveras, Route 4, and they extended the Bayshore Highway to San Jose, but San Francisco had to pay for the portion in the city.
What's interesting to me is, there's some of these route additions in 1925 that were lining up to be U.S. routes, specifically from Needles to Topak and pretty much everything beyond Barstow that would become U.S. 91. So when we get into a little bit more of the U.S. routes specifically, there's some major shifts in the alignments and road quality in those corridors. It went from dirt goat paths to just major highways within a decade.
Now, what's coming to my mind as I read this is, I know there was a shift in the US 91 and the Barstow to Jean Highway because it originally went to Yermo. Was the 1925 one actually the Yermo terminus?
So US 91 gets kind of interesting. It was originally going to follow the original alignment of the Arrowhead Trail, which would have had it end in Bannock, which is east of Goffs on what would become US 66. Then the Silver Lake Cutoff was built, which is kind of the jog that you see that kind of I-15 takes now. So it did go through Yermo, and it actually originally ended in Daggett, and that lasted for a couple of years until an overhead was built over the railroad in Barstow. 1927, the Breed Bill was passed. Added 1 cent to the gas tax exclusively for highway construction. 51% in Northern California, 49% in Southern California.
That's a significant shift at this point, because before, if you recall in the last episode, we were seeing a lot of stuff being done in Northern California. This is where we're now starting to see, hey, Southern California is going to get a lot of the stuff.
Yeah, there was a lot of movement of commerce that occurred in the late 19th century. It kind of you have to follow railroad chronology in any way. You kind of see that shift begin kind of in the 1870s, where a lot of the southern ports were found to be pretty useful. So ironically, a lot of the major highways in California more or less followed those railroad corridors. But this is kind of an extension of that shift from Northern California to Southern California. The Department of Public Works reorganized to have 4 divisions, including the Division of Highways. State Classification Act defined the 40 primary state highways. I
haven't gone out and looked at the act in a while. Do you recall what those 40 highways were?
I'd have to look at a list, but I know some of the obvious ones like 4, 2, 1, 3, and this is what would become the legislative route definitions. So like a lot of these would end up being U.S. routes. It's pretty much a lot of the obvious corridors, but yeah, there's quite a few of them, and it kind of even followed that pattern when the signed state routes became a thing in 1934. Pretty much they're like a one-for-one match.
As the decade of the 20s closed out, we had a few additional things happen. We had the Toll Bridge Authority established in 1929. This was sort of getting ready for the major toll bridge push that was going to happen, and we'll see it in the 30s in the Bay Area, especially with the construction of the Golden Gate and the Oakland Bay Bridge. And I think there were also a couple of toll bridges up in the Carquinez-Sacramento area being built. In 1930, the criteria for what is a state highway was established. And in 1931, we had a large number of secondary highways added or extended in the state system. So some of these notable additions were Legislative Route 58, which went now from Bakersfield to Mojave. And we had talked earlier about some other portions of 58 that were built. LRN 26 was extended from El Centro to Calexico. LRN 77, which is what would eventually become portions of 395, was extended from Riverside to San Diego. LRN 43 went from Waterman Canyon to Newport Beach. This is what would eventually become both US 91 and Route 91, and was also part of Route 18. LRN 19 went from Beaumont to Riverside. This is what would become, I want to say it's part of US 60, but I think with Beaumont, this is US 60 and later Route 60.
Yeah, also briefly US 70, but that's a story for another time. That's the Moreno Valley Badlands.
And they just did a new truck lane in that area, in fact.
They did. I saw it under construction when I was just out there earlier this year.
LRN 2 was extended from San Diego to the Mexican border, which goes to show you, when US 101 was first created, it went to San Diego, not to Mexico. This extended it down to the Mexican border. One of the more interesting highways, LRN 80, which went from Santa Barbara to Zaca via the San Marcos Pass. This is what is now Route 154, but included things like, it was 150 and 154, and 246 was part of this. And I want to say there was one other highway number that all went into this area.
192. It was all originally 150, but it got pieced out gradually over the years.
And many of these corresponded to the newly defined U.S. highways.
Next on the California highways, route by route. As we go deeper into the 1930s, we have some significant changes occurring, which we'll talk about in our next episode. Here's a glimpse of what you'll see. State highways authorized in urban areas, over 6,700 miles of roads added in 1933 alone. Signage of the state highways starts, continued adjustments and extensions of highways, passage of the Freeway Act, Defense Highway Act in 1941, slow growth through 1945 due to the World War II.
It's a really interesting era, and then it really slows down in the 40s. And then in the episode after this, we'll get into the 50s and the start of the interstate system.
Yeah, it's the amount of impact World War II really had, not just on California, but everywhere, is just, I think in a modern sense, is really understated. You pretty much had the emergence of modern road and freeway systems ready to go in the early 1940s, and that war really slowed it down almost by a decade.
As I recall, on the Federal Interstate Act, they had really wanted to start that stuff in the 40s, and it just got delayed. For more information, as always, visit the chronology section over on cahighways.org. Most of the Gribble Nation blogs on California touch upon the early days, including the development of the U.S. highway system. I don't think there's a Gribble Nation blog that specifically touches on chronology.
Some facets of it, but not the overall chronology.
The Federal Highway Administration has some really good pages on the history of the federal highway system, which I got some of the information for this from, and there'll be links to those on the show page at caroutebyroute.org. As always, details for specific routes are on the specific route pages out on cahighways.org and gribblenation.org.
As always, information on this episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can leave us a comment on the episode. This episode is also available on our Anchor FM home, anchor.fm/CA route by route. Join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route.
Some credits. This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fear, edited by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is I Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Glover-Kine. If you've got an opening theme that you think might be good for our show, and it's either in the public domain or you're willing to let us use for free, please drop me a note at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. Our episodes are recorded using freeconferencecall.com. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblnation.org. And if you might be interested in becoming a supporter of the podcast, once we have that established, please contact me at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. Any closing thoughts, Tom, on the era of the 1920s?
This is where the state highway system really gets exciting for me because this is the early U.S. route system era. So really, I look at this as the classic era of road and infrastructure. This is really before the freeway corridors got going. This is kind of like where you see like all this nostalgia and lore comes from this era.
What do you mean by nostalgia and lore? You mean all these memories of like the Dust Bowl and stuff like that? I thought that was more the 30s, but
It's kind of an amalgamation of both of them. But really, I think when people think of the U.S. route system, they think back to the 1920s and 1930s era.
I think this is when we're first seeing the heavy construction going on that is starting to link the state and make the travel across the state possible.
Yeah, this is really, I think it's interesting because this is just such a change. This is from like the 1910s where it would have taken you weeks to probably get out of the state to be something you could practically do within a day.
And we'll see next time more stuff that happens in the 1930s. Hope you enjoyed the episode.